Hello again. Welcome back to the Money Corner. I think as a financial planner, financial consultant, stockbroker, I've had a number of titles in the past few years. Probably the two topics that I deal with most frequently, or the two concerns that all of my clients have. First, retirement planning, and secondly, for the younger people who still have to face the prospect of educating children, the cost of education, the cost of college planning. My guest tonight is a man who has had a wealth of experience in this area because he's an experienced academician, administrator, both in the private sector, private schools, and has had extensive public school experience as well. He's a local person, James Van Amburg from the Dwight Englewood School in Englewood, New Jersey. Jim, welcome to the Money Corner.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming over. Jim, just by way of background, in the past 15 to 20 years, and by the way, as I said to you when I went before the show, I went through college in the 50s. I had the GI Bill of Rights, and my folks certainly would not have been able to pay for my college education. The government did it because, fortunately or unfortunately, I was right at the tail end of World War II and qualified for GI benefits. Now, the average family in America no longer has that, although we have some men in the armed forces who are in college credits. And families today become shell-shocked when they look at the cost of college, particularly if we look at private schools. Now, is that a warranted anxiety? Is the college education pricing the average American family, the average American student, out of a college degree?
Well, I can tell you as a father of two sons, still looking at the prospect of college, I think there's a lot of reason for anxiety. Mm-hmm. I think you hit the nail on the head, though, when you talked about the issue of private schools. I think that the present situation has some very good news in it when we look at where the country's come from the 50s and the early 60s, in that in most states in the United States, accessibility to public education now at the higher education level is vastly improved. Certainly states like California, states like New York have gone out of their way at this point to expand systems. And in terms of middle class and upper middle class families, certainly a quality public higher education experience is available to students to larger numbers and percentages than it would have been, say, in the 50s, if we don't look at the issue of the GI Bill. I think the issue of private schools, though, and the ones that we hear most often and we see on the cover stories in Time and Newsweek, the very competitive Ivy League institutions, the very prestigious institutions, it's another question. There's no question that tuitions have gone up considerably faster during the 80s in particular, faster than the cost of living. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We could talk about that. But it certainly is a reason for some anxiety for families, particularly for those who are upper middle class and may feel that they don't qualify for financial aid.
Jim, the parents in your school, the Dwight Englewood School in Englewood, mm-hmm. which is one of the prestigious private undergraduate schools in the United States, those people take on a burden if they start their children, and you start at the first grade.
We start at the 7th grade, Phil.
Okay, you start at the 7th grade.
We're a secondary school.
You've got a companion school.
There are feeder schools who indeed where students come
from, sure. You start at the 7th grade, mm-hmm. but parents putting a child in your school take on the obligation and overhead, I would think, at least $6,000 a year.
For those in high school at this point, we're in the $9,000 range.
$9,000
we're
a year.
Close to $10,000.
That means that family, all right, for the high school years, the 4 high school years, have taken on a burden of at least $40,000.
That's right.
And $9,000 is no longer really cheap for a college.
No question.
In the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
So you're starting to talk about families that face an overhead per student of $100,000, $150,000. It's easy to get up to $250,000
mm-hmm.
in terms of education. One of the things that precipitated my inviting Jim on the program tonight to talk about the cost of higher education really was an article I saw in the Wall Street Journal back in September. Jim and I are in a service club in Englewood together, and we were at lunch one day, and I said, Jim, my gosh, I read the Wall Street Journal today, and I see that the government is starting to get concerned about the uniformity of tuition amongst Ivy League schools. Brown, Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, Dartmouth, Columbia, Yale, Princeton, Cornell, all had tuition within perhaps $600 of each other. It was uniform from 18.6, the lowest school, Cornell, to 19.5, Brown, the highest, and they were all in the same range. Now, the Justice Department, and the article said, had really opened up an investigation saying, hey, do we have collusion going on? Is there a violation of the antitrust laws? And I think this is a factor we have to look at, Jim. Do we have a inflexibility now which really either dictates price or puts the parent at a disadvantage or makes it a kind of closed shop which is imposing hardships on society?
Well, I think we have lots of pieces of this to talk about, Phil. I think, first of all, let's talk about the 20 schools now that are being investigated. I personally think it's a very interesting situation. I think that probably recently...
And these are all Ivy League schools?
Well, they're very competitive schools. Some are not. For example, Oberlin in Ohio is on the list. There are several others. Some Wellesley, some of the girls' schools are on the list. But in general, they're schools that see themselves as being extremely competitive.
Ivy or near Ivy.
Essentially.
Uh-huh.
And certainly in most cases, they see themselves as competing for the same pool of students in many ways. I guess the point I'd make first is that in the big picture, as interesting as I find this case, I think that it is only a drop in the bucket when you look at the great diversity of higher educational opportunity in the country. In other words, I think we have to look at private versus public institutions. I think we have to look at the vast number of small private schools where there's a great range of cost of tuition. So to imply that what's going on in these 20 schools is true for all colleges in the United States, I don't think is true. What I would say about this case is, I think recently the president of Oberlin was quoted after they had been served their subpoena on this one for financial records. And as I understand it from some of the lawyers involved in this, the subpoenas are incredibly detailed. This is not a political public relations ploy. The Justice Department is really doing a serious investigation here. I think the answer, he said, for example, he was very proud of the fact. He said that they saw no problem in sharing with their colleagues what they were doing. The answer was a very collegial answer. He obviously didn't see the other colleges as competitors. He saw them as being colleagues, and they were all in the same business. And it was a mindset that was very different from most of the applications of the antitrust law in business. I think what it says to me is that these schools see themselves as competing, but they have not chosen to compete on the issue of low price.
Well, Jim, is it wrong of us as a society to drag the antitrust laws out and apply them in this area? Is that disadvantageous? Is that inappropriate?
Personally, I think it's very interesting. I think it's going to lead to some interesting kinds of competition among the schools that they haven't had to even think about. But I think it's important to understand why this is occurring among that particular group. I mean, you talked a little bit ago about why the parents in my secondary school make this incredible investment. And we have some cases where mothers are working full-time to do nothing but give their children the best secondary education they think they can provide. And I think one of the answers is, if competing on cost was in any way hurting the Ivy League schools at this point in terms of their market and their pool, you would see them begin to compete on cost and perhaps you'd have a different situation. My question is, if you look at the statistics, even in spite of declining birth rate coming through at this point to the colleges, we're now talking Ivy League acceptance rates of 18% or 20% of the applicant pool. I think they have been reinforced in a way that there is a question of elasticity on that tuition.
Is that a change, 18% of the applicant pool? What was it 10 years ago? What was it 15 years ago? Was it different?
Depending on the school, obviously, but in some cases you've gone from a third or a 40% rate to an 18% rate. Some of these schools have become, and for an interesting reason. I think that I see it among the parents in my school. I think parents feel at this point the one thing that they can purchase for their children is the best possible education. We could argue what that means, but the best possible school, the most prestigious in the case of colleges, and parents are willing to pay these tuitions somehow. Or there's a whole other issue in this, they qualify for financial aid, which is one of the structural issues in this tuition figure. But if you ask me, do I personally believe that if the antitrust law is applied and they really investigate that these schools that there has been some collusion on price fixing, whatever here, I think they've compared all their data. I think where they've chosen and they feel they have to compete is in other ways, like spending more money on new buildings and all sorts of other things.
I have a friend who's an economist at Columbia, and he's been on the Money Corner 3 or 4 times, and he made a comment several years ago when he was on here. He was very happy about the Japanese and the automobile industry because the Japanese coming in and putting a lot of cars in America was going to be a great boon to consumers.
Right.
You had more product, more supply, and it lowered prices. Now, I'm sure you're going to say, hey, wait a minute, an education and an academic education is not just a matter of availability. I don't know.
I would argue that.
Okay,
Sure.
what would you argue?
All right. I think what I would say, Phil, on this is I don't think the answer is that more is going to make it cheaper. I think what we've seen is we have served a much larger percentage of our population by differing models. Accessibility to state institutions, for example, has opened up possibilities where they didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago. However, what I'd argue is I think the possibility for, I'm not going to say lower prices, but perhaps in the future restraining some of those increases is going to come from some other issues here. I think what drives the cost of tuition increases, in part really, is that it's a labor-intensive industry. A large percentage of college budgets is going into the cost of hiring professors and competing. We want to talk about the prestigious schools competing for the name professors. A lot of the cost sharing that's gone on among the Ivy League and similar schools has been sharing costs also on their salary schedules and so on, because they compete for the same pool of professors.
Well, you could make the same observation. I'm going to interrupt you for a minute, but for example, as you know, I'm active in community life in Englewood, and I'm on the Board of School Estimate in Englewood. In our public school system, I believe that 70% of our cost factor is in labor.
Yep, sure.
And I would think in the Dwight Englewood School, what is your labor factor?
Probably 80%.
80% of your dollar goes for labor cost.
Yes.
And that's true on the college level as well.
It varies depending on whether you're talking about a research institution or not in terms of some other overhead, but it certainly is a large percentage of the cost. But let me carry that further, because what I was going to say, I think beyond that is, once you take that piece of the budget and you assume that there's going to be a certain set increase in labor cost as cost of living goes up, of course you have to pay employees and so on. Aside from that, there are a number of other factors which vary from school to school, in which I see a lot of promise in some cases, and in other cases I'm not so sure that I do, and I think it depends on the institution. For example, I think one of the problems right now that drives the tuition increases is the fact that most institutions feel they have to have everything for everybody, that they've got to offer the full smorgasbord to compete for the best students. Higher education is not an industry, for the most part, which has specialized in the way that we could make the analogy to some of private industry. I think of it in terms of the hospital analogy. Every hospital seems to feel that it has to have every kind of major surgery, the new MRI units, and so on. Not that they do and not that the state approves. But part of the issue on cost containment in healthcare has come from the state stepping in and trying to get hospitals to specialize. Everybody does not have to be a coronary care provider. You can have a good one, and in fact, the research certainly shows that if you get people who specialize in it, it may even be better care. I think we're going to begin to see, as the pressure is applied here by the marketplace, that a number of schools are going to start specializing more. They're going to start doing some dealing with some issues of productivity that they haven't had to. They're going to start doing more co-op programs among institutions so that everyone doesn't have to duplicate that. There are schools now that are beginning to think about, for example, in East Asian languages or certain other programs where they may not have a high enrollment in their own institution, the fact that shared resources, that satellite beaming, for example, of programs from one college to another. There are institutions that have done this and have set some models in place that others are beginning to look at. There are issues like that that have some hope of cost containment, or at least in terms of increases.
So this really is the introduction of technology that you see coming about, or the restructuring in order to keep the cost from escalating.
I think that's one possibility. Now, I'd say that I see another side to it in some institutions.
Okay, let's hold off on the other side for a moment.
Right.
We're going to break. We're going to pause for an announcement. We'll be back very shortly. Stay with us, please, and let's try and find out some of the reasons why college costs have been going through the roof. We'll be back in just a moment. We're back again. Let me reintroduce Jim von Amburg, the event that you came in the first part of the program. Jim is the headmaster of the Dwight Englewood Private School in Englewood, New Jersey, which is a very fine school, commands a great deal of prestige, and just has an excellent reputation. Jim has a perspective. He's headmaster of the private school. However, prior to being here, he was a member of the University of Chicago, and he also was a superintendent of the public school system in Massachusetts. So, Jim, you see the problem of tuition costs, college costs, impact on parents from many, many different viewpoints. I want to pick up one thing you were talking about just before we took our break. You made the point that we will see some changes and some cost effectiveness come about as schools increasingly begin to use what you view as technology, sharing resources or using computers or videotapes, modern communications, in order to get lessons across to broader groups of people so as to lower cost. Fine. However, aren't many people particularly in higher education, enamored of things like the small seminar group where you have the one classical professor, very much in the ivory tower with 4 or 5 students who are kind of disciples. And
There's no question, Phil. There's no question about that.
So tradition.
You have tradition. And I think in many ways you're also talking about essentially what's been a two-class situation in higher education. I mean, in many ways, the small private institution has essentially marketed the fact that they were running on that classical model with very small class sizes, and things were taught around the seminar table and so on.
Is that kind of a European modle?
Oh, it very definitely comes out of the European. In fact, it's almost a medieval model in terms of how the student studies with the scholar and a great deal of personalization in the process.
All right, Jim, for a moment, as we talk about cost and cost factors, let's talk about models, because one of the apparent things is the tremendous achievements of the Asian kids in the United States right now. And I guess the Asian children and the Japanese students bring this tremendous dedication and motivation to the class situation. Now, that model really would resist the technology you're talking about.
Well, all right, number of issues here. First of all, I don't think it's as simple as you just presented it. I mean, I think there are all sorts of questions in which I think ethnic generalizations break down in terms of parental stress on education, parental backing for what's going on. I mean, there's no question that in the United States, many of our most successful Asian students, as well as some who aren't, are coming from homes which are placing a very high priority on not only what's going on in school, but all of the support educational situations. So I think that's part of the culture. So we're talking about a cultural issue. But I think there are a number of issues. For example, if you look at Japanese elementary and secondary schools, you'll find class sizes which are much larger than even those that are complained about in the United States in many cases. It has
They'll
to
go
do
to
with
35 students?
Certainly. Absolutely. But the reason is, in part, that they're doing what we would consider a part of the definition of what supposedly we would like our best schools to be doing. I find it fascinating talking to educators with whom I've discussed this, that particularly the Japanese educators feel there's no question in terms of the amount of math material and theory that they cover with their students. They feel that they're moving through a curriculum at a much faster pace. In terms of fundamental underlying material, they think that they master that at younger ages. On the other hand, they're extremely jealous of a great deal which our educational system covers in terms of the creative process with students, in terms of students' responsibility to be able to deal outside of narrowly defined discipline-oriented subject matter. So I think it's a complicated issue. But if you look at higher education, you've got in some ways the same analogy here. You've got the school which tries to provide with the professor who teaches a small number of teaching hours a week, small seminar classes, and then you've got the very large institution running with the TV section and once a week graduate student seminar. And there's no question there's a difference in the cost of offering those two alternatives.
Jim, once again, in personal lives, as you know, I recently got married for the second time. And my wife is a graduate, and I'd like to use her school because it is illustrative. She's a graduate of Swarthmore.
Right.
One of the things that impresses me, by the way, that school prided itself on the seminar method of teaching. And many, many, many of her classes and courses in 4 years was going through an education with perhaps 5 students and a professor. Mm-hmm. But if you look at where their graduates, the Swarthmore graduates are, it's extraordinary.
Sure.
I went to a reunion down there last year. I met more people who are chairman of the department in this medical school, or a top flight person in the State Department, or a Michael Dukakis, who is a presidential candidate. Now, I don't want to bring that up as the model, but apparently there is something about, maybe it's a stereotype of getting a child into Harvard as opposed to getting into a Rutgers, which is becoming much tougher now, by the way,
absolutely, there's no question.
as the economy changes.
It isn't only a question of difficulty in getting in. There's no question that Rutgers now is a wonderful institution. And I mean, if in our discussion so far this evening, I've been careful to try and talk about the fact that we've got a whole range of options at this point for people. I will tell you right now, in the view of many of my students, that some of those who are looking at Ivy League schools also are looking at some of the best public institutions in the country. Some of those schools have come a long way.
Why are your students doing that? Why are they willing, or why are they enamored of a public school as well as a private school?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think there are two issues. In some cases, it's simply because in some cases the tuition is less. Though going out of state, if you're talking out of state, that's not always true. But I think the other issue is that some of the state institutions, because of the emphasis that certain state legislatures have put on their state institution, have become wonderful institutions in terms of the quality of what they offer students.
Well, there is this thing now, the hot school.
Yeah.
Duke is a hot school.
Duke is a hot school, right. And the state schools, Virginia's a hot school, and Chapel Hill is a hot place to be. And so, I mean, we can, there certainly is a certain amount of trendiness to what people perceive as being prestigious.
So you have
institutions.
students now who would just as soon go to a Chapel Hill as they would an Ivy League school and feel that they're not taking second best.
We certainly have some students who would definitely do that now. Certainly more than would have been true, a long time ago.
I'm sure the one generality you're going to come up with is that there is no one educational model that is the perfect educational model.
That's where I want to go from you're talking about Swarthmore. I mean, I think Swarthmore is a wonderful institution. I think the question that higher ed is going to have to face more and more, though, is does everything that's taught in the university have to be taught on that model? Is that the most effective model for certain things we're trying to achieve, and there are other things that can be achieved in other ways? And the reason why Swarthmore's tuition is as high is that that is the structural issue that's driving their cost. And they have a high tuition because they're providing a great deal of personal attention in those small seminars. There's some other issues in other institutions, though, that drive their costs. Some of those can be changed, some of them can't. I'm not suggesting Swarthmore should change what it is. They seem to certainly have a long line of people who would love to be there and are willing to pay that price and take advantage of that wonderful education. There are some other cases, though, where there are other things driving tuition that aren't controllable and people don't have options. For example, research universities now that are running medical centers are in a real bind. In many cases, undergraduate tuition increases are subsidizing the cost of running clinics in the university hospital.
Why don't you tell the audience the University of Chicago story that you told me before?
Well, one of the things that fascinated me at Chicago was that being there, watching a school which had a business school that they prided themselves on, watching the way that the university was managed, on the other hand, was another question. And they were caught between the Byzantine model of the Nobel laureate sitting in the library with 2 graduate students and so on, and the fact that they had an enormous medical center servicing the south side of Chicago, in analogy to our area here, the South Bronx in many ways, right there a few blocks from the campus. Certainly something they couldn't drop no matter what the federal subsidy was cut back. And they also had a large number of graduate professors, an esteemed research institution, whose students certainly did not in their tuition support the cost of the research operation. So what you really had was, if we're going to talk about costs, a situation where undergraduate tuition, and where certainly tuition at the business school, which was very popular and bringing in lots of students, was in essence being asked to support problems in a medical center for a period of time, and certainly the cost of expensive graduate research operation, that it was very expensive. And there were a lot of structural issues in that aren't so simple. So I think, and that's very different from a Swarthmore, where there's a decision to run a certain kind of undergraduate education without the graduate research school component that has to be supported.
Jim, we don't have too much time. The subject is so vast and we can really cover it for hours. But our audience may not appreciate the advantage that some schools are at who have a large endowment.
Oh, major issue. For example, if you talk about just tuition, if that's what we're talking about, on average at this point, 1/5 of the cost of educating a child in a state university comes from tuition. The rest fundamentally is state funding. It's one of the reasons why if there's a recession, it's hard because the pressure is on to raise the tuition at the very time when things are toughest. On the other hand, in the private school, on average in the United States, half of the cost of the child's education comes from tuition. The other half is coming from a variety of sources, but the major one usually is endowment income for those schools that have endowment. There is no question that the private institution that has a large endowment is able to compete much more effectively, is much less dependent on tuition than the school that's barely making it, where tuition is much more important.
The other thing that surprised me, Jim, in our pre-show discussion, was your contention that many, many college professors, although today the college professor who earns $60,000 and higher is not a rarity, still are behind the times in relation to
I would say,
salaries adjusted
I
for
don't
inflation.
claim to know all the research. I read some recently that said that they've about held their own. That the real difference in the increase in real dollars in the cost of tuition now from what it was 20 years ago is not out of those labor costs. They have pretty well held their own and had to be increased, but that's been a cost of living issue. It really comes from several other things. I mean, it's coming from the financial aid issue, which is every time tuition goes up, schools have had to increase financial aid, which in effect means that many, except for the rare school that is very heavily endowed, many parents who are able to pay the bill are paying also a portion of someone else's to increase that financial aid. That's
Why is that? Does a percentage of every dollar coming in tuition get designated for aid to another student?
In most institutions, it's right out of the operating budget. They're going to designate an amount to be used for financial aid. The tuition goes up more than the cost of living. The amount of the financial aid budget usually is raised the same amount as tuition, not the cost of living usually. And
So it's passed on to the
it's passed
parent
on. Sure.
who's paying the bill?
Who's paying the bill. That's been part of it. And particularly in the last couple of years, when federal money that's been available to students in need, when financial need has been cut back, there's been more pressure on the institution to increase the pool available to those students, and therefore tuition is one of the sources of their income. So,
Jim, on a per capita basis, we're educating more people now than we've ever educated at a higher and higher level.
right.
When I went through high school in the 40s, many people viewed a high school education as adequate. I think today now more and more people and more families say at a minimum a college education is now desirable.
I think there's no question. I think my own feeling is we're becoming a two-class society, and to get into that upper group, to get into the job market at any reasonable level now, a college education is almost becoming the ticket.
So more and more, when they talk about an underclass or a class trailing behind, one of the components there is just lack of educational credentials, which prevent them to move into another notch in terms of skills. And
well, I think if we look at the job creation in the country in the last 8 years, you've had two groups. You've had the highly technical job creation where a college education is minimal to get into that new job market, and then you've had the fast food jobs and so on, which are, at this point almost a high school graduation is required for.
On that note, we're going to end. Thank you for being with us tonight, and I want to thank Jim Van Amburg for being with me. He's a very interesting man. He's got a lot more he could say to us, and perhaps he'll be back again, talk to us at greater length. Good night. Have a good week. See you again on the Money Corner soon. Good night.